The story of the United States begins with a paradox, a nation founded on the sublime ideal that all men are created equal, yet built upon the brutal foundation of chattel slavery. This fundamental contradiction, this birth defect, would ultimately tear the country apart, leading to a bloody reckoning that redefined American freedom. In the spring of 1861, a nation stood on the precipice of its own self-destruction. A dream woven from promises of liberty was about to be drowned in the smoke of cannons and the chains of human bondage. This was the American Civil War, a conflict not just between regions, but a painful, necessary surgical attempt to remove a malignant moral wound at the heart of the Republic. For decades, the North and South developed along radically different economic paths. The North, fueled by industry, factories, and rapidly expanding rail lines, fostered a labor-intensive capitalism. The South, by contrast, was an agrarian society whose entire economy was monstrously reliant on the forced, uncompensated labor of nearly 4 million enslaved African people. The myth of Southern gentility, built upon fields of cotton, rested on a foundation of profound horror. For a century, Congress attempted fragile compromises to hold the two worlds together. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 and the contentious Compromise of 1850 were mere temporary bandages. When new territories like Kansas and Nebraska sought statehood, the question became unavoidable. Would they be free or slave? This bleeding Kansas debate pushed the nation into a fever pitch. The election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860, a politically moderate but staunch opponent of slavery's expansion, was seen by Southern states as the final intolerable threat. In their view, Lincoln aimed not just to limit slavery's reach, but to destroy their entire way of life. Secession began even before the votes were fully tallied. South Carolina was the first to declare its departure, followed quickly by Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas, forming the Confederate States of America, with Jefferson Davis as their president. The first shot of the war was fired on April 12, 1861, when Confederate forces attacked the Union-held Fort Sumter in Charleston, South Carolina. Lincoln declared the action an insurrection and vowed to preserve the Union by military force. The fall of Fort Sumter, a bloodless opening, was the prelude to the bloodiest conflict in U.S. history. This event prompted 4 more crucial states, Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina, to join the Confederacy. Virginia's secession was the most consequential, bringing with it military genius like Robert E. Lee and the Confederate capital of Richmond. Part 2. The Inferno, a bloody reckoning. The Civil War remains the deadliest conflict in American history, claiming approximately 620,000 soldiers' lives, more than the American fatalities in World War I and World War II combined. Both sides initially expected a swift victory. However, the First Battle of Bull Run in 1861, a Confederate victory, shattered any illusion of a short war. The Confederacy had clear initial advantages. They fought defensively. They only needed to survive. And their military leadership, particularly Robert E. Lee, was superior. The Union, the North, however, possessed overwhelming industrial capacity and a much larger population. The Union's objective was to capture the Confederate capital and sever the Southern economy along the Mississippi River. In September 1862, the war reached its most violent turn. The Battle of Antietam in Maryland was the single bloodiest day in American history, with nearly 23,000 casualties. While militarily a draw, politically it was a Union victory that gave Lincoln the opportunity he needed. On January 1, 1863, Lincoln issued the historic Emancipation Proclamation. The proclamation did not immediately free all slaves. It applied only to those in Confederate-held territory. But it dramatically shifted the war's purpose. The fight was no longer solely about preserving the Union. It became a righteous crusade for human freedom. The proclamation encouraged thousands of African Americans to join the Union Army, bolstering the North's military might. The year 1863 was the true turning point. In the East, Robert E. Lee's thrust north into Pennsylvania was decisively repelled by the Union Army at the Battle of Gettysburg. The three-day battle broke the back of the Confederate Army. Days later in the West, General Ulysses S. Grant secured control of the entire Mississippi River by capturing Vicksburg, effectively splitting the Confederacy in two. Following these victories, Lincoln delivered the Gettysburg Address, reframing the war as a new birth of freedom to ensure that government of the people, by the people, for the people shall not perish from the earth. 1864 brought the final crushing blows. Lincoln appointed Grant general-in-chief, who engaged Lee in a brutal attritional war around Richmond, Virginia. Simultaneously, General William T. Sherman launched his famous March to the Sea. Adopting a policy of total war, Sherman's army destroyed military and civilian targets across a 60-mile swath of Georgia. After capturing Atlanta, Sherman reached Savannah, leaving a trail of destruction and despair that broke the Confederates' will to fight. On April 9, 1865, under relentless pressure from Grant, Robert E. Lee surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. After 4 years of devastating conflict, the war was over. The unfinished revolution, Reconstruction's promise and failure. Mere days after the war's end, a fresh tragedy struck. Abraham Lincoln was assassinated on April 14, 1865, by Confederate sympathizer John Wilkes Booth. Lincoln's death was a profound loss, as he had planned a merciful and swift process for Reconstruction, the period from 1865 to 1877, dedicated to integrating 4 million newly freed African Americans and readmitting the Confederate States to the Union. The early efforts established the Freedmen's Bureau, providing food, shelter, health care, and education to formerly enslaved people. However, political conflict soon erupted. Lincoln's successor, Andrew Johnson, favored a lenient approach to the South. Meanwhile, the congressional radical Republicans pushed for a harsher, punitive Reconstruction and robust protection of the civil rights of freedmen. This period saw the passage of 3 transformational constitutional amendments that forever altered the legal framework of America. 1. The 13th Amendment, 1865, formally abolished slavery. 2. The 14th Amendment, 1868, granted citizenship to all persons born or naturalized in the U.S. and guaranteed equal protection under the law. 3. The 15th Amendment, 1870, secured the right to vote for African American men, regardless of race or previous condition of servitude. In the South, African Americans became politically active, electing representatives to Congress and state legislatures, and striving to acquire land and education.
But this progress met a fierce backlash from white supremacists. Terror groups like the Ku Klux Klan emerged in 1866, launching a campaign of violence, intimidation, and murder against black voters, politicians, and their white allies. Reconstruction was tragically abandoned in 1877 through a controversial political agreement known as the Compromise of 1877. In exchange for the Democrats' acceptance of Republican Rutherford B. Hayes as president following a disputed election, the federal government agreed to withdraw all remaining Union troops from the southern states. This withdrawal removed the last shield protecting black citizens. With federal protection gone, southern states quickly implemented Jim Crow laws. These laws legalized racial segregation and introduced disenfranchising measures like literacy tests and poll taxes to strip African Americans of their voting rights, ensuring their relegation to a subordinate, second-class status. The Civil War had destroyed slavery and saved the Union, but the failure of Reconstruction ensured that the struggle for justice and equality would continue for another century. Harap's Part 4: The Gilded Age, Triumphs and Turmoil. As Reconstruction ended, ushering in the darkness of Jim Crow in the South, the North exploded into a new era, the Gilded Age, a term coined by Mark Twain. On the surface, it glittered with gold and technological wonder, but underneath lay a morass of deep poverty, political corruption, and social inequality. This was a time of colossal American transformation. The completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869 knit the coasts together, accelerating the national economy. Industries like steel, oil, and railroads grew at an unprecedented rate, giving rise to men who were either robber barons or captains of industry. John D. Rockefeller ruthlessly built an oil monopoly with Standard Oil. Andrew Carnegie created an empire of steel, providing the material for America's modern infrastructure and skyscrapers. Cornelius Vanderbilt controlled the railway network. These men concentrated wealth in a manner never before seen, often at the expense of their workers, who toiled for subsistence wages in dangerous conditions. The engine of this industrial revolution was the American city. Populations in New York, Chicago, and Philadelphia exploded, largely due to a massive wave of European immigration. Ellis Island became the gateway for millions arriving from Ireland, Italy, Poland, Russia, and beyond, seeking the American dream. These immigrants provided the cheap labor for the factories and swelled the ranks of urban tenements, creating a vibrant, yet often squalid, new America. The new economy was volatile and frequently violent. Conflicts between owners and laborers intensified, resulting in events like the Haymarket Riot in Chicago, 1886, and the Pullman Strike in 1894, where federal troops were often used to crush workers' demands for an 8-hour day and safer conditions. Industrialists held fast to the philosophy of laissez-faire capitalism, resisting government interference. Compounding the chaos of wealth was deep political corruption. Powerful political machines like Tammany Hall controlled the operation of cities for their own gain. This intimate fusion of money and power disenfranchised the common citizen. Meanwhile, in the South, the Jim Crow system became legally entrenched. In 1996, the Supreme Court's infamous ruling in Plessy v. Ferguson upheld the doctrine of separate and equal, giving legal sanction to hundreds of discriminatory laws that enshrined a vastly inferior, segregated status for black citizens. In response to this extreme inequality and economic injustice, a new movement began to gather strength at the turn of the 20th century, the Progressive Era. Hair Wraps Part 5, The Progressive Tide and the World Stage. The moral bankruptcy of the Gilded Age spurred the progressive movement, a broad, multi-class effort to clean up corruption, improve labor conditions, and restore democracy to the people. The movement's early champions were investigative journalists and writers known as muckrakers. Ida Tarbell exposed the ruthless business practices of Rockefeller's Standard Oil. Upton Sinclair's novel The Jungle revealed the horrific sanitation and labor abuses in Chicago's meatpacking industry. Their work galvanized public opinion, forcing political change. The pressure eventually found its champion in the White House, Theodore Roosevelt. Having gained fame leading his Rough Riders in Cuba during the Spanish-American War, 1898, Roosevelt became president in 1901. Roosevelt was the quintessential trust buster. He used the Sherman Antitrust Act to break up large monopolies, pushed for railroad regulation, and championed public health with the Pure Food and Drug Act. His philosophy was the square deal, that every American should have a fair shot. Roosevelt's successor, Woodrow Wilson, continued the reform streak, establishing the Federal Reserve System to stabilize the nation's finance, and the Federal Trade Commission to ensure fair business practices. Crucially, the progressive era saw the successful culmination of the nearly 70-year struggle for women's suffrage. Led by activists like Alice Paul and Carrie Chapman Catt, women secured the right to vote with the ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920, vastly expanding American democracy. Alongside these internal changes, the U.S. abandoned its traditional isolationism and stepped onto the world stage. Following the Spanish-American War, the U.S. acquired Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines, emerging as a major global power. Theodore Roosevelt's initiative to build the Panama Canal linked the Atlantic and Pacific, projecting American commerce and military power worldwide. America's manifest destiny was now global. By 1914, America was powerful, industrialized, and confident. But as the drums of World War I began to beat in Europe, the nation was faced with a new test of its global responsibilities, a war that would forever change its economy, foreign policy, and society. Part 6, World War I, Instability, and the Roaring Twenties. When World War I began in Europe in 1914, President Woodrow Wilson pledged strict neutrality. Most Americans wanted to remain aloof from the old world's troubles. Yet America's vast industrial output supplied the Allied powers, Britain, France, and Russia, with arms, food, and credit, making true neutrality impossible. German U-boats began sinking American ships, most notoriously the British passenger liner Lusitania in 1915, killing 128 Americans. Tensions peaked in 1917 when British intelligence intercepted the notorious Zimmermann telegram, in which Germany proposed an alliance with Mexico against the U.S. In April 1917, Wilson persuaded Congress to declare war, stating the goal was to make the world safe for democracy. The American mobilization was immense. Led by General John J. Pershing, the AEF, or Doughboys, arrived in Europe by mid-1918 when the Allied forces were exhausted. Their fresh manpower and resources proved decisive, helping the Allies secure victory. On November 11, 1918, Germany signed an armistice. After the war, Wilson brought his 14 points to the Paris Peace Conference. He advocated for a just peace and the creation of the League of Nations to prevent future conflicts. However, European powers sought revenge, and Wilson was forced to compromise heavily on the Treaty of Versailles. The ultimate tragedy was that while the League of Nations was his brainchild, the American Senate never ratified the treaty, causing the U.S. to retreat into isolationism just when global leadership was most needed. For returning soldiers, the 1920s were a cultural explosion, the Roaring Twenties. The nation's industrial capacity, honed by the war, shifted to consumer goods. Henry Ford's assembly line made automobiles affordable, allowing ordinary Americans to own a car for the first time. The concept of buying on credit fueled a rapid expansion of consumer culture. Urbanization and new technologies shattered old social norms. Jazz music became the soundtrack of the age. Women underwent a dramatic change. Flappers wore short dresses, cut their hair, and challenged the Victorian conservatism of the previous generation. The decade was also marked by a great social experiment, Prohibition, 1920 to 1933. The 18th Amendment outlawed the manufacture, sale, and transport of alcohol. Intended to enforce morality, it did the opposite, fueling organized crime. Gangsters like Al Capone controlled the illegal liquor trade, and life behind the closed doors of speakeasies became even more vibrant. A central point of cultural rebirth was Harlem, New York, home to the Harlem Renaissance. Writers like Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston created a new American literature rooted in the Black experience. But this glittering decade rested on weak economic and social foundations. Rampant speculation in the stock market, agricultural depression, and profound inequality in wealth distribution were building toward a catastrophic collapse, one of the darkest tragedies in American history. Part 7. The Great Depression and the New Deal. The exuberant Roaring Twenties ended with a thunderous crash. On October 29, 1929, Black Tuesday, the New York stock market plummeted. This day marked the beginning of the Great Depression. The impact on the American economy was catastrophic. Thousands of banks closed, wiping out life savings, and investment dried up. Industrial production collapsed, and the unemployment rate soared toward 25%. 1 in 4 working men and women was jobless. Families who lost everything built shanty towns, derisively called Hoovervilles, after the sitting president, Herbert Hoover. President Hoover believed the economy would stabilize on its own, and that government intervention would only worsen the situation. His laissez-faire policy deepened the public suffering. Already struggling, the agricultural sector was devastated by a severe drought in the Midwest, creating the Dust Bowl. Thousands of farmers lost their land and became internal migrants, moving west to California in search of work. In the 1932 election, Franklin D. Roosevelt defeated President Hoover. FDR brought a message of hope to the American people. In his famous inaugural address, he declared, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." Within his first 100 days, FDR launched a bold and comprehensive reform program known as the New Deal. Its goals were threefold: relief, recovery, and reform. 1. Relief. Direct aid and job creation for the unemployed. The Civilian Conservation Corps hired young men for public works like reforestation and road building. 2. Recovery. Programs to revive the economy, such as the Agricultural Adjustment Administration and the National Recovery Administration. 3. Reform. Permanent institutional changes to prevent future crises. The most crucial was the Social Security Act of 1935, which established a social safety net for the elderly, unemployed, and disabled. The Securities and Exchange Commission was created to regulate the stock market. FDR used his fireside chats over the radio to communicate directly with the public, rebuilding national confidence. The New Deal marked an unprecedented expansion of the federal government's role in citizens' lives, permanently altering the trajectory of American politics and economics. Despite these changes, the Great Depression did not fully lift. Unemployment remained high, and racial and gender inequalities persisted. However, the New Deal had restored faith in democratic capitalism. While America struggled with internal recovery, the rise of fascist powers in Europe and Asia, Nazi Germany under Adolf Hitler, and Japan under Tojo, threatened global stability. Roosevelt realized that America's isolationism was being challenged by external dangers. The nation's final full escape from the Great Depression would come only through global war.
Part 8. World War II and the Birth of a Superpower. When Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, launching World War II, Roosevelt pledged American neutrality but secretly prepared to support the Allied powers, Britain, France, and China. The Lend-Lease Act, 1941, was his key maneuver, allowing the U.S. to lend billions of dollars in war material to the Allies without formally entering the war. Roosevelt famously argued that America must be the arsenal of democracy. But on December 7, 1941, everything changed. The Imperial Japanese Navy launched a devastating surprise attack on the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. Thousands of Americans were killed, and the Pacific Fleet was crippled. This date, which will live in infamy, shocked America out of its isolationism. On December 8, 1941, the U.S. formally entered the war. The American mobilization for World War II was staggering. The unemployment caused by the Great Depression vanished overnight. American factories ran 24 hours a day, producing aircraft, tanks, ships, and war materiel. Detroit, the Motor City, transformed into the arsenal of democracy. American society underwent massive change. Millions of men fought in Europe and the Pacific, and millions of women took their places in the factories. Rosie the Riveter became the iconic symbol of the women who stepped outside traditional gender roles to perform essential war work. The war also revealed one of America's darkest racial moments. By executive order, Roosevelt authorized the forced removal and internment of approximately 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry, most of whom were American citizens, from the West Coast to desolate camps, a terrifying example of mass panic and racial prejudice.
The war was fought on two main fronts. One, the European theater. Under the command of General Ike Eisenhower, U.S. forces fought through North Africa and Italy. The decisive moment came on D-Day, June 6, 1944, when Allied forces invaded Normandy, France, paving the way for the liberation of Europe from Nazi control. Germany surrendered in May 1945. The Pacific Theater, a brutal campaign of island hopping, saw American forces fighting fierce battles against a determined Japanese resistance on islands like Iwo Jima and Okinawa. The prospect of a full-scale invasion of the Japanese mainland promised hundreds of thousands more casualties. In April 1945, Franklin Roosevelt died and Harry Truman became president. Truman was immediately faced with an impossible choice. The top-secret Manhattan Project had successfully developed the atomic bomb. To force Japan's unconditional surrender and avoid a costly land invasion, Truman made the fateful decision to use the new weapon. On August 6th and 9th, 1945, atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, killing an estimated 200,000 people. Japan quickly surrendered, and World War II was over. The war's conclusion established the U.S. as an unmatched global power. Europe was devastated, and Britain and France had lost their empires. America emerged as the world's foremost economic and military leader, holding a temporary monopoly on atomic weapons. A new age had begun, the age of the superpower, for which a new adversary was already waiting, the Soviet Union. Part 9. The Cold War and Cultural Clashes. Following World War II, the relationship between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, ostensibly wartime allies, quickly deteriorated. The ideological gulf was too wide. American capitalist democracy versus Soviet communist totalitarianism. Winston Churchill declared that an iron curtain had descended across Europe, dividing the continent. Thus began the Cold War, a battle of ideology, geopolitics, and military posturing, devoid of direct military conflict between the two superpowers. The U.S. adopted a policy of containment, aiming to stop the spread of Soviet-backed communism into new territories. This led to the Marshall Plan, massive financial aid to rebuild Western European economies to prevent the rise of communist influence. NATO, 1949, the formation of a military alliance between the U.S. and Western European nations to ensure collective security against the Soviet threat. The Truman Doctrine, military and economic support to countries like Greece and Turkey to resist communist takeover. In 1950, the first hot war erupted on the Korean Peninsula when Soviet-backed North Korea invaded the U.S.-backed South. The U.S. intervened under the umbrella of the United Nations. This bloody application of containment lasted 3 years, establishing a permanent dividing line, the 38th parallel, that exists to this day. Domestically, the Cold War created immense political tension. Fear of Soviet espionage and communist infiltration led to the Second Red Scare. Senator McCarthy's witch hunt, known as McCarthyism, targeted thousands of government officials, artists, and educators suspected of being communists, leading to blacklisting and civil rights abuses. The 1950s was an era of unprecedented prosperity and conformity. The post-World War II economic boom fueled a new middle class. Millions of families moved from cities to suburbs, where they enjoyed affordable housing and personal automobiles. The baby boom led to a massive population increase. Television, rock and roll music, and fast food defined this new consumer culture. The feminist movement. The second wave, led by figures like Betty Friedan and Gloria Steinem, demanded equal pay, reproductive rights, the landmark Roe v. Wade decision, and equal opportunity in the workplace. Environmentalism. Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring, awakened environmental concerns, leading to the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, and the first Earth Day. In the midst of the chaos, America still achieved a profound victory in the space race. Neil Armstrong became the first man to walk on the moon in 1969, a symbol of American technological prowess and optimism. However, the 1970s brought little stability. Oil crises, economic stagnation, and inflation plagued the American way of life. International humiliation, such as the Iranian hostage crisis in 1979 and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, challenged American power abroad. The stage was set for the rise of Ronald Reagan. His message of conservatism and strong foreign policy restored a sense of national pride, preparing the country for the final chapter of the Cold War. Part 11. The End of the Cold War and the New Millennium. When Ronald Reagan was elected president in 1980, he brought a new conservative wave to America. He was successful in restoring optimism, and he took a hardline stance against the Soviet Union, famously labeling it the evil empire. The Reagan administration drastically increased military spending, including the controversial Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, nicknamed Star Wars. Reagan's aggressive foreign policy and military buildup placed immense economic strain on the Soviet Union. Coupled with internal reforms, glasnost and perestroika, under Mikhail Gorbachev, the Soviet bloc began to crumble. In a landmark moment in 1989, the notorious Berlin Wall, which had divided East and West Berlin, was torn down. It was a potent symbol of the collapse of communist totalitarianism. 2 years later, in 1991, the Soviet Union formally dissolved, marking the end of the Cold War. The U.S. was left as the world's sole superpower. The Cold War's end presented America with new challenges. Under President George H.W. Bush, the U.S. led an international coalition to liberate Kuwait from an Iraqi invasion in the Persian Gulf War, 1990 to 1991, a demonstration of American military technological superiority. The 1990s, under President Bill Clinton, saw one of the longest economic expansions in U.S. history. The Internet and information technology revolution, the dot-com boom, fueled rapid economic growth. However, Clinton's term was marked by scandal, and he was impeached by the House for personal conduct, though acquitted by the Senate, raising serious questions about the ethics of the White House. Despite the relative peace after the Cold War, a new threat emerged at the turn of the millennium. On September 11, 2001, militants from the terrorist organization Al-Qaeda launched coordinated attacks on symbolic American landmarks. Nearly 3,000 people were killed at the World Trade Center in New York, the Pentagon in Virginia, and on a plane that crashed in Pennsylvania. The 9/11 attacks created a profound sense of national unity, but they also forever changed U.S. foreign policy. President George W. Bush declared a war on terror. This led the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan in 2001 to dismantle al-Qaeda's base. Later, in 2003, the U.S. invaded Iraq to overthrow Saddam Hussein on the basis of ultimately false intelligence regarding weapons of mass destruction. These two long, costly wars entrenched the U.S. in Middle Eastern politics and had long-term economic and psychological consequences for the nation. The 2008 financial crisis, caused by a collapse of the housing market, had a global impact. It crippled the economy in the final years of the Bush presidency. The 2008 election was another watershed moment in American history. Barack Obama, the first African-American president of the U.S., was elected, a symbolic triumph for the civil rights movement. The Obama administration focused on economic recovery from the recession, a slow withdrawal from Afghanistan and Iraq, and major health care reform, the Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare. America's journey from the dark legacy of slavery to the election of a black president was a profound one. Yet, the nation remained deeply divided. Faced with cultural and political polarization, economic inequality, and global challenges, the U.S. continues to grapple with its foundational ideals. Part 12. The Age of Polarization and Digital Fracture. While Barack Obama's election, 2008, brought a wave of hope, it quickly met with harsh reality. The recovery from the 2008 economic crisis was slow and uneven. While large financial institutions were bailed out, ordinary Americans struggled with job and housing value recovery, exacerbating economic inequality. Public anger against Wall Street and the banking system fueled the Occupy Wall Street movement, 2011, whose rallying cry was, "We are the 99%. On the other side of the political spectrum, Obama's presidency immediately sparked a powerful conservative backlash known as the Tea Party movement. This movement mobilized against government spending, taxes, and health care reform, like Obamacare. The Tea Party created an uncompromising, deeply conservative faction within the Republican Party that pushed Congress into unprecedented levels of polarization, leading to frequent legislative gridlock. The fire of this polarization was stoked by social media. While platforms like Facebook and Twitter sped up the flow of news and information, they also enabled the creation of echo chambers, where people consumed only information aligning with their views, easily dismissing opposing perspectives. This new digital environment made political and cultural divides faster, angrier, and more personal. Obama's foreign policy successes included the killing of al-Qaeda leader Osama bin Laden, 2011, and the Iran nuclear deal, 2015. However, the rise of ISIS in Syria and Russia's aggressive policies, including the seizure of Crimea in Ukraine, challenged America's global leadership. The 2016 presidential election marked a radical shift in American politics. Against the establishment political figure of Hillary Clinton, Donald J. Trump, a real estate mogul and reality TV star. Good morning. Ready yet, underneath the stability lay deep social injustice. Jim Crow laws still held sway in the South. But the Cold War put pressure on the U.S. to live up to its role as the champion of democracy worldwide. Against this backdrop, the civil rights movement emerged as an unstoppable force. In 1954, the Supreme Court's landmark ruling in Brown v. Board of Education declared separate but equal unconstitutional, dismantling the legal foundation of racial segregation in schools. Led by the nonviolent resistance of figures like Martin Luther King Jr., starting with Rosa Parks' 1955 Montgomery bus boycott, the movement gained momentum. Iconic moments like the I Have a Dream speech and the Freedom Rides forced the nation to confront its legacy of racism. The movement culminated in the passage of the Civil Rights Act 1964 and the Voting Rights Act 1965, which finally ended the Jim Crow era. In 1961, John F. Kennedy became president, promising a new frontier. Young, charismatic, and hopeful, his administration tackled global challenges like the space race, the Apollo program, and the frightening brinksmanship of the Cuban Missile Crisis. But his light was extinguished in a tragic assassination in Dallas in 1963, plunging America into grief and altering the nation's political and social trajectory. Part 10. Vietnam, Watergate, and the Shifting Identity. From the mid-1960s into the 1970s, the U.S. was rocked by a series of crises that forced the nation to re-examine its government and its ideals. At the center were the Vietnam War and the Watergate scandal. The Vietnam War. As part of its Cold War containment strategy, the U.S. committed itself to protecting South Vietnam from communist North Vietnam. Under Presidents John F. Kennedy and Lyndon B. Johnson, American military presence escalated dramatically. But U.S. forces struggled against local guerrilla warfare and the nationalistic fervor of the North Vietnamese. The war created a deep fissure within the U.S. For the first time, Americans watched the brutality of war on television. The anti-war movement began on college campuses and quickly grew into a national phenomenon. Rock music, the hippie counterculture, and the demands of the civil rights movement amplified the anti-war sentiment. Millions of young people protested the draft and the war itself. The Tet Offensive, while a military failure for the enemy, convinced the American public that the government was lying and that the war was unwinnable. Lyndon B. Johnson eventually chose not to run for re-election. Vietnam and Watergate fostered a deep distrust among Americans toward their government and institutions. The hopeful nation was replaced by one marked